Welcome back. Time now for the François debate, and today we've got our eye firmly focused on political developments across the Atlantic. We've now had more than 24 hours to take stock of Donald Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton in the presidential election. That's an outcome which, for the most part, the pundits and the pollsters failed to predict. Well, Trump's victory will bring to an end 8 years of Democratic rule, and it sends the United States on a new path. Well, in keeping with tradition, US President Barack Obama has today been hosting the president-elect at the White House. That is a first public step towards the transition of power. The two men have had almost no one-on-one contact until today. And let's not forget, Trump was the champion of the birther movement, which questioned Obama's US citizenship. He's also pledged to overturn the outgoing president's signature policy achievements upon taking office on January the 20th. Well, for Obama's part, he campaigned vigorously for Hillary Clinton and called Trump both temporally unfit for presidency and dangerously unprepared to have access to the US nuclear codes. So what the mood was actually like at their talks is anybody's guess, but in front of the cameras, the language was courteous. Well, during their first talks as well, the First Lady Michele Obama has been meeting privately with Trump's wife, Melania. Well, in today's debate, we discuss the transition to Trump and what it means for the United States and its relations with the outside world. On our panel today, Jean-Pierre Larochelle, who is the director of the Political Forum, which is a Paris-based weekly forum on politics. Welcome to you. To my left, Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, who is the senior policy fellow at the think tank, the ECFR, that is here in Paris. That's the European Council on Foreign Relations. Very good to have you with us. Good evening. From Cape Cod in Massachusetts, I'm joined by Pippa Norris, who is a lecturer in comparative politics at Harvard University. And a very warm welcome to you. From Washington, we have there Julien Piquet, who is a congressional correspondent for the Al Monitor online magazine. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us. Well, in our discussion, we're going to be taking you from the United States to Mexico, to the European Union, to Russia, North Korea, and wait for it, Zimbabwe. This is a little map, as you can see there, of just the sort of direction we want to take our conversation in. That's for the end of the first half of the debate. So we'll bring you into the rest of the world in the second half. But for now, I'd like to start with domestic policies. And let me start with you, Jean-Pierre. We're looking at one country, two tribes, aren't we? Looking at those protests on the streets of the United States these last 24 hours. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Well, I'll tell you, the last several presidential elections have been very divisive, and we've seen pretty much the same electoral map. And so there's a big division in the country between essentially the central states, which tend to be the red states, and then the coastal states, which tend to be the blue states.
Okay, and what about you? I mean, what's your reaction to just basically what's happened these last 24 hours, 48 hours?
I guess it's consistent with the degree of polarization that has been valid in the US for quite a long time, not just for the campaign. And you can see the concession speech by Hillary Clinton and the meeting today at the White House, efforts by the Democratic leaders to play the transition fairly and as it should be. But it also shows that not everything is over just because the election is over, and the country remains very divided, and that probably augurs badly of the way that the administration is going to be able to push the country back on Make America Great Again, as the president-elect Trump says.
Let me turn to Pippa Norris at Harvard University. Of course, you're in Massachusetts. Pippa, is that a place where people have been chanting, or where you can feel that sense of that hashtag and that slogan, not my president?
There have been really tremendous emotional reactions after the election because it was just so stunning. All of the commentary, the opinion polls consistently pointed, as we know, towards a narrow lead for Hillary Clinton, but nevertheless a lead. And to suddenly have this revolution overnight mean everybody's been struggling with this. And polarization is nothing new. We've had this, after all, for many, many years, between the House in particular, the GOP, who've been very obdurate, and the Democrats and Obama, blocking much of the legislation he tried to put through. But clearly this election has shocked both those who won, by the way, as well as those who lost.
Okay, and what about sort of smashing up store windows? We've seen that in California. We've seen people in Chicago extremely angry out on the streets. I mean, is there a feeling that this is all going to die down? What's your hunch?
So we always thought it was going to be the Trump forces who were going to be the ones who were angry. Always before the election, Trump was saying the results would be fraudulent or rigged, and people didn't expect him to win. So the fact that suddenly this shock has happened to the Democrats, who were, you could argue, somewhat complacent, and who really did predict that it was Hillary's turn in some ways, has really sent a shockwave. So there has been obviously demonstrations in recent times before this. Think about the Black Lives Matter, and that's polarized people as well. Whether it persists, it seems doubtful. The way that we're moving forward, and the signals also from Obama have very much been to accept the outcome of the election. This is where we go. We always are a constitutional republic. So I think things will settle down in the longer term once this emotional wave passes through America.
Let's go to Washington now, to Julien Piquet, who is there. Julien, of course, there were some emotional scenes outside the White House on election night. Supporters of Hillary Clinton extremely disappointed, standing there, many of them in tears. Do you see that sense of anger and sadness lasting? Let me put that question to you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's no question. And, you know, there's a real sense here that the people are so disappointed. I mean, you have to realize that 4 states that went for Obama, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and another one I can't think of right off the top of my head, but those states that went for Obama, you know, there's always talk about racial resentment and et cetera, and I think that's not really what this election is about. It's an election about deep resentment. This president who came to power 8 years ago with a lot of promises, people feel like they haven't been delivered on, and now we have a new president making, you know, a new set of promises, and there's this deep sense that, you know, there's a deep sense, I think, across the country that a deep sense of disappointment in the economy and the political system. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think the resentment is going to go away on either side necessarily.
And can you remember a time when we've ever known so little about what the genuine tensions are of a president-elect? I mean, we're at a point where we keep saying his economic details, his economic policies are all very sketchy. We seem to say that about a lot of his policies. Can you remember ever having known so little about a potential presidential, the president-elect?
No, of course not. I mean, that's the whole issue here, and it's even more shocking on the foreign policy side, frankly. You know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, there's that old saw that personnel is policy. And that's what everybody, I think, in this town and possibly across the nation is looking at, is who is Donald Trump going to put in power? And that, at that point, will tell us a lot about what might happen next. I mean, there are obviously campaign promises. There's, you know, repeal Obamacare, replace it with something else. What that would be is anybody's guess. The same with, you know, the Iran deal, where you need to renegotiate it. But you know, there's so few specifics. I mean, as you know, this election was very much about a clash of personalities. I mean, especially on Donald Trump's part. It was all about his, you know, his overbearing almost personality. And if you remember, there was chatter a few months back that he was going to perhaps choose John Kasich, the Ohio governor, as a vice president, and that he would give him unfettered power basically over domestic and foreign policy, and Donald Trump was going to take care of making America great. And of course the Trump campaign sort of, you know, tore down that story. But nevertheless, you have that idea out there that that Trump himself might not be involved in that day-to-day, and so who he chooses, you know, at Treasury, at State, at the Defense Department to really run the show, possibly, is going to tell us a lot. But right now, nobody knows here or across the nation or across the world really what's going to happen next.
Manuel, do you get the impression that we're dealing here with multiple Trumps, the campaign Trump, the president-elect Trump, and then there'll be President Trump, who are going to say slightly different things? You know, what he said on the campaign trail was extreme. You know, he said things that subsequently he's already watered down, like that ban on Muslims entering the United States has disappeared from his website all of a sudden. He seems to be backpedaling on a couple of his hardline positions. Do you see that continuing as he gets to grips with the reality and the enormity of the office?
There are two things. There's one thing, which is we have already had multiple Trumps during the campaign. He said different things on different issues, or even on the same day in different places. When he went to Mexico and when he came back to the US, he had two different visions of this, the infamous wall he wants to build on the border. But I don't want to stress that kind of thing, because that's actually the case in most cases. What I think is even more important than this idea of multiplicity is that Trump has basically theorized the idea of being unpredictable. And that's very much the case in foreign policy in particular, where basically his view is that being unpredictable is part of how you put yourself in a good position, in a better position to get the right deals. And so he's very at ease with this idea of being unpredictable or looking unpredictable. I don't think we should overestimate the idea that he has no clue and he actually can change his mind. There's a lot of issues on which he's been very consistent, not just during the campaign, but over the years. Around the 80s already, he was saying a lot of things on trade that look similar to what he's saying now, for instance.
Jean-Pierre, do you genuinely see Trump overruling and basically putting the clock back to the days of before Obamacare and basically undoing so much of his predecessor's work? I mean, do you think that's even possible?
I think that he is going to attempt to try to take back on some of the measures that Obama's made. But I think it's quite true that a lot of this has to do with his management style and with his showmanship skills. And we've already seen that during the campaign, where he's sort of moderated his views. And that's why Obama's meeting with him today. And Obama is stressing with him the importance of continuity, both in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. And Obama's going to try to make the case to try to continue some of these programs and the upheaval that it would cause with the dramatic change. Now, of course, the Republican House and Senate really do want to target, especially the Obama health care, for instance. They already have an alternative proposal that they say they're ready to put in place. It's interesting because the polling shows, even amongst those people who are opposed to Obamacare, they don't want it taken away.
Pippa at Harvard, let me go back to you, Pippa Norris. Do you think that during that 1.5 hours or however long it was that Barack Obama and Donald Trump were together at the White House a little earlier on, do you think he managed to sell this idea to Trump that continuity is so important? And if you don't mind, please don't undo all my hard work these last 8 years.
That seems somewhat unlikely for two reasons. One is that clearly Trump has generated such expectations of change. And in the exit poll, it was clear that this was an election in which the American public in general wanted change. That's often common, of course, after two successive terms by one party. People want the other party to come in. And so that's generating, he's got to deliver on some of his promises. And clearly repealing Obamacare is an easy delivery for the GOP. What replaces it, we don't know, but turning back the clock on some of that is easy. And on immigration, he can also do some things, in particular through executive order. But there's a second uncertainty. It's not just what does Trump stand for, what are his policies, where there's a tremendous ambiguity, I think. Over the campaign, he said one thing, and then he said something else, as we've said. But he also, of course, has to negotiate with the House and with the Senate. And there we've got a very different set of priorities. In particular, conservatives, like Ryan, are adamantly opposed to some of his policies on trade, are adamantly opposed to some of his policies on benefits and maintaining welfare services, and a variety of other things where they've really got to knock heads together. Trump is not a traditional Republican. He hasn't come out of that party. And so it's going to be fascinating to see basically who has the upper hand, whether it is the Senate and the House in particular, or whether it's going to be the White House, which really dominates in the policy discussions.
Okay, Pippa Norris at Harvard, you've had the last word for this first half of the debate, the focus very much being on the domestic aspect. I'll be back in a moment. We'll be looking at the international aspects and be looking at the world's reaction to the transition to Trump.